I remember saying to him, what's Uber, and more importantly, why on earth are they letting you invest? Women are half the population.
Just because the consumer is paying for the whole thing, the whole bill, and the whole bill is incredibly expensive.
We shouldn't be suffering like this. Why did we have companies like Uber, Instacart, Spotify that existed? Why were these companies not existing in something as important as healthcare? It's like it's going to become a commodity. Like you're either using it or you're dead. America is not a cash pay country. It works on insurance.
Hi, I'm Mike Gelb, and this is Consumer VC, where we talk about what it takes to invest in and build scalable consumer businesses. If you're enjoying this show, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes. And sign up to the newsletter at theconsumervc.com for a weekly roundup of the latest consumer fundraisers, product launches, and new episodes. Our guest today is Rachel Springate, who is one of the founders of Muse Capital. Muse Capital is an early-stage venture firm that invests in founders that are shaping the future of how we care, play, and live. Rachel started her career, though, in corporate partnerships. We talk about how she got into startups in the first place, the role Troy Carter had on her and her career, and the development of Muse Capital, how she met her co-founder, Assia, and the moment, actually, that led to them building out their thesis together, an underlying mission, and also the expansion to SPVs into sports franchises. But before we get into today's episode, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Glimpse. Glimpse is an AI-powered end-to-end deductions management service that's focused on recovering revenue from KeHE, UNFI, Amazon, and Target for consumer brands. They centralize deductions with backups, they handle disputing on your behalf, on the brand's behalf, and they streamline the accounting process. So check out Glimpse, link in the show notes. And with all that said, without further ado, here's Rachel. Rachel, thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you?
I am wonderful, and thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of the podcast and the incredible guests you've had. So thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for listening, and really excited to dig in on everything that you've built with Muse Capital. But before we get to Muse, I want to start originally with your path. You began in luxury partnerships, then you went on to entertainment, and now you're in venture capital and in the wonderful world of finance. What's the kind of takeaway or earned secret from that journey that most shaped how you invest today?
I think the connecting thread across my entire career is relationships. I think that was what I developed very early. I started my career in brand research. That's how I actually built relationships with marketing directors of Fortune 500s. Then in my next role, when I was global head of corporate sales for a luxury lifestyle group, I expanded those relationships, working with, more brands, but also celebrities, sports teams. And even in the transition into startups and venture capital, it was those relationships that even still today allow me to succeed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes total sense. How well, I guess first I'll ask about how you met Assia, your co-founder. I know you first connected during the Spotify deal and you were consulting at Dubset. But what did you see in each other? How did the interaction happen that made you think, hey, maybe we should work together?
Yeah, it was a defining moment, that's for sure. And that happened probably 12 years ago now. I think in terms of how Assia and I met, so just to backtrack a minute. So I had all these incredible brand relationships. My expertise was business development. I'd been creating these deals between these groups for a long time. And then after doing that, I just thought, hey, there's, what can I do with these relationships that is not basically making my old bosses like, a lot of money. And so I ended up meeting somebody who kind of opened my eyes to the startup world and kind of how that all worked. And that person was a guy called Troy Carter, who I'm happy to talk about. And at the time, he was Lady Gaga's manager, and she was the biggest pop star in the world. This was 2012, so you'll get my age. And he told me that he'd been spending a lot of time in Silicon Valley. And I'm like, what is a music manager? What is a music manager doing in Silicon Valley? And he said he had been talking with a lot of startups and had actually just invested in a company called Uber. And I remember saying to him, what's Uber? And more importantly, why on earth are they letting you invest? And he said, because of my network. I bring my contacts across, entertainment and help these companies grow. And I remember just being, really fascinated at the time and saying, well, how do you do that? And given my network and my background, I'm like, how does this work? And so he talked me through it. And I was extremely inspired. In fact, so inspired that I remember thanking him. And he said to me, listen, there's very few people in our world that don't just have the relationships, but also the business knowledge to get these deals done at this kind of level. And it's definitely something you should think about. And sure enough, he was the reason that I then pivoted. And I ended up creating my own consultancy, which is where I would leverage my old network to help startups grow. So that's what I started. And just to give you some examples, I was helping startups do early deals with Disney, do a partnership with the likes of a Selena Gomez. So it's taking my old network and then helping get them in front of the founders and structuring these deals. And actually, that is how I met Assia. So the backstory here is, in my consultancy, one of my clients was this audio recognition technology. It was around the time of SoundCloud, when SoundCloud was just stealing market share from Spotify. I wanted Spotify or one of the other big streaming companies to partner with the company, either partner with or maybe acquire the company. And so the woman that I was introduced to do that at Spotify was Assia, who is now my partner in the fund. And her and I met. Spotify was just launching in North America. She had moved from Stockholm to LA to kind of open up the LA office to oversee M&A. And, I walked in there, just another meeting, and said, hey, SoundCloud's stealing market share. I have a technology that can help you, change that. Let's do this. And that was it. That was a moment. We ended up working against each other on that deal for nearly a year. So you get to know someone very well, sitting the opposite side of the table. And we ended up doing the deal. And after doing that, we just said, hey, we spent our entire careers building other people's companies, yet we have this extremely complementary skill set and network. And what do we want to build? What's our legacy? So that's how we met.
Wow. I'd imagine how much you learned from somebody negotiating against them for 1 year. So that's amazing. Your transition. I want to talk a little bit about your transition from going from corporate partnerships and particularly connecting brands, corporations with celebrities, for example, and kind of other areas. Of course, this is also common as well with startups, where you also have these types of partnerships happen, or even with creators and others. Some of them have gone really well. Some of them have not gone very well. And some of the companies don't perform or fail, just like a lot of startups. To talk to you a little bit about some of the differences first, that transition, working at Fortune 500s, then going down to startups. And as well as, I'm sure a lot of startups are thinking about, how do I land a celebrity, or should I even have a partnership with a celebrity? What is your approach when it comes to these matters?
At this point, having over a decade of experience of doing this, I think you've learned a lot and you've seen a lot. And the market has changed a lot from when I first started doing this, in the consultancy days, now to doing it as an investor. And I think the common thread here is, first of all, the most important thing is that the partnership has to be authentic, right? Gone are the days of somebody, posting for money and equity. There has to be some sort of authentic alignment. Say that talent has suffered a pain point that your product or your app or technology is actually solving, that is a very important part of this.
Do you think
And
the reason for that is because consumers have gotten smarter?
absolutely. I think that the best partnerships are the ones that are authentic. And actually, a really good signal of it is that even today, I don't even look at trying to do deals with celebrities that want to do it for equity. They need to have skin in the game. And so the best relationships and the best partnerships are where the celebrity is actually investing into the company and truly believes in their mission and can very authentically help push the mission. So authenticity is number one. Um, and then the second thing is definitely timing. So you do not want to go to a talent when you are too early in your journey, because I've learned this the hard way, maybe earlier in my career, where maybe we'd set up a partnership where the technology just wasn't ready for the inbound, what was about to happen with that talent. And so timing is really important. You don't want to, go and approach your dream talent and say, come on board and make this push and push this organically to your audience if you're not ready, right? If you're in our world, we do a lot of investing in women's health, and there's a lot of talent that's very passionate about that. But you don't want to, have that happen if you have like one clinic or something, right? Because you don't want to create a big rush. And so timing is really important. I think they're the two main things.
No, that's a great point about when do you kind of put on the gas per se, or can you have enough when you actually have all that inbound, right? And all an interest, if you can't actually fulfill your obligation or what you're set out to do because maybe you're cash strapped, maybe you're just not at scale for whatever, if it's a physical product business or maybe it's a software business, you just don't have the power to do so, then I think that first impression goes a long way. And so if that happens, then it might be really hard to recover.
Absolutely. But then, like you said, when you get it right, it's really powerful. And we have lots of examples of companies and talent who have got it right.
Totally. So you and when did you and Assia, excuse me,
Mhm.
when did you and Assia decide to start a venture capital fund and actually start Muse?
So, interesting story. After her and I did the deal between the two groups, we, we'd had exposure to venture capitalists just through the kind of the nature of the work that we were doing. And we could never really understand why they weren't more helpful or able to do the kinds of things that we were able to do as operators, right? For us, we were experts in helping a startup get their very first revenue deal, distribution deal, partnership. Um, and so we just thought it was a real missed opportunity. Like, why aren't there more venture capitalists who can be helpful to those entrepreneurs? And it felt like if we came in as an investor, you're going to want to take our check versus someone else on the cap table, given our operational experience and our network. And so the original idea for Muse was, why don't we combine forces on the consultancy and just start like writing angel checks as well as doing our consultancy work for kind of sweat equity in the companies. And as we were literally building this out, my partner, Assia, got diagnosed with breast cancer. And I remember when all of that happened, the two of us kind of stopped what we were doing. At this point, we were super close. And I ended up like moving in with her essentially and helping her through that whole journey. And us going through that experience together is actually what helped inform our thesis at Muse. And what we experienced through that was we just couldn't understand, as elder millennial technologists is what I'd say, is why did we have companies like Uber, Instacart, Spotify that existed why were these companies not existing in something as important as healthcare? And more importantly, what was happening with women's health? It didn't make sense to us. And so actually through going through that together, we saw the opportunity. And this was, over a decade ago now. And it was that very personal experience that led us to found Muse.
Wow. That's very, very powerful. When you realize, so when you first before your partner got diagnosed, in terms of how did you kind of assess opportunities from that standpoint rather than and then you kind of realize what your mission was, if that's fair to say.
Mhm.
Um, how then did you connect the dots and also then build your network when it comes to in women's health and really kind of understand what are, interesting opportunities versus must exist opportunities?
I think, going through that whole breast cancer fighting episode together,
Mhm.
it was a 6-month process. And, a lot of things happened. And for the two of us, we were just baffled because we're like, hang on, a lot of this stuff seems so backwards, so broken, can be resolved with, simple technology. First of all, why is it happening? Well, there has to be something we can do about it because it doesn't make sense. Women are half the population, and we shouldn't be suffering like this. And so what ended up happening, she got through it, 6 month double mastectomy, totally,
Yeah.
10 years in remission, thank goodness.
Wow.
But just going through that, after doing the research and kind of looking at kind of health tech in general and looking at the amount of money that was going into women's health, it just didn't make sense. Well, like, how is it that this is half the population? Um, and, why aren't there more entrepreneurs building and why are they not getting funded? And after looking at that, we saw the opportunity. We're like, well, none of this makes sense. It feels like these kind of sectors should be funded. And why shouldn't we be the ones to do it? And I'm sure you can imagine, like, going out and talking about investing in sectors like women's health 10 years ago is a very different place. Today, I think the market realizes how huge the opportunity is. But back then it was a lot harder.
Well, what was it like then raising your first fund from LPs in a sector that was quite contrarian, right? I mean, now it seems like women's health, there's a lot more awareness to it.
Mhm. Yep.
Still not nearly enough awareness that maybe needs to happen in terms of
Yep.
dollars that are actually invested, but I would say there's probably certainly a lot more interest or awareness since 10 years ago. What was it like you and Assia raising your first fund with this thesis?
Probably one of the hardest things we've ever done in our respective careers, to be brutally honest, for a couple of reasons. Not coming from the traditional, venture capitalist background, not having the tick boxes that most institutional LPs would look for. But also, building a thesis about these honestly kind of taboo markets, right? It's eh, at the end of the day, when 95% of venture capital dollars are controlled by guys, it's like, when you're going out there and you're trying to raise capital in these very like female specific sectors, things get lost in translation. You present the stats and, we had some really shocking feedback. I think when I had an investor that asked us what kind of things in women's health we'd invest in, and when we said things like menopause, I mean, I kid you not, this person said, well, that's for a niche. And you're like, wow.
God.
I mean, it's just one very, like, very sad example of the things that we were facing back then, but not really that surprising. Um, I think I should also say, like, women's health is kind of where we started, but our thesis of the fund is investing in overlooked opportunities across the future of how we care, play, and live. And, in the care bucket, it's like, what's an example of a horribly overlooked, underfunded sector? It's women's health. Um, and so, identifying that back then, raising the capital, thankfully, we had our old network that backed us. People that, understood us, had worked with us, understood our kind of, superpower. And, they were from our old network. They were not institutional LPs. They were family offices from our old world, owners of sports teams, owners of media companies, C-levels of Fortune 500s, some talent, just people that really believed in us and our mission. And thank God for them, because there's no way we would exist if, we didn't have those early supporters and that belief. Like I said, making the early bets, 10 years later, you're like, well, we kind of told you so. But honestly, like, I think if we look at what our edge is as a fund, and props to my business partner, she's definitely very visionary in terms of seeing things 10 years ahead of everybody else. Like first with Spotify and streaming, and then and then women's sport, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and women's health. Yeah, like today people understand it. Back then, not so much. But isn't that what makes a good venture capitalist?
Totally. Absolutely. That is exactly what makes a good venture capitalist. What was the fund structure for Fund One? What was how much were you able? What was the size of the fund, and as well as what was your deployment strategy?
So the way that Muse started, so back in 2017, the two of us started with an angel vehicle. And we just used that angel vehicle to prove that A, we could get access, and B, we could deliver on what we said we could in terms of, partnerships, etc.
This episode is brought to you by Glimpse. Glimpse is an AI-powered end-to-end deductions management service that's focused on recovering revenue from KeyHe, UNFI, Amazon, and Target for consumer brands. They centralize deductions with backups, they fully handle disputing on your behalf, the brand's behalf, and streamline the accounting process. For more information, check out tryglimpse.com and let them know that Mike sent you.
That little angel vehicle, we ended up having some great success. We had 2 exits within 14 months, which typically doesn't happen, right, in venture capital. And so we had this, very promising start. And then when we went out to raise our first fund, now this was the end of 2018, it was pretty shocking. Like I said, you can imagine going out investing in these sectors was kind of depressing. But somehow, again, with the support of our old network, we were able to raise a first $13 million fund. So
That's awesome.
1-3. And I just cannot believe how hard that was. But thankfully it happened. And so we started off with the angel vehicle. We kind of proved that we could deploy capital and return capital. Then we decided to start a dedicated fund, went out to the LPs in our network, were able to cobble together, that first venture fund. And then out of that vehicle, we wanted to do a couple of things. We wanted to use that first vehicle to prove that we could do what we said we could do, right? If we're talking about our edge and our superpower being the fact that we can help those startups get their very first, major revenue deals, et cetera, then let's do that. And so in that fund, we did 30 deals over 3 years. And some of them today, certainly in the women's health space, are some of the leading companies. So
that's amazing. How do you balance? Because of course we've seen, a few ways when it comes to big trends within venture. For example, we had, blockchain a few years ago, for example, and now we have, of course, AI.
yes.
How do you balance when it comes to your investment thesis
Mhm.
and what you and what you and Assia are committed to building with Muse versus maybe some of the outside noise when it comes to different kind of mega trends that are happening, or even trying to incorporate some of those mega trends into your thinking relating to the categories you're investing in?
A couple of things that are pretty fascinating about these overlooked markets. Typically, they're pretty recession proof, right? If you think about something like women's health, future of childcare, elderly care, like the sectors that the future of parenting, these are typically, huge sectors that are not subject to these huge market swings. And so that's the first point. Yes, we've been through the hype cycles. But I will say Assia and I definitely remain disciplined throughout that. I think, our view for trends like AI today, the whole view here is, look, AI has to be baked into your product or offering, just like you had to have, the internet as part of your, company, during that boom. It's like it's going to become a commodity. Like you're either using it or you're dead. And so what I think is really interesting about us is firstly, overlooked markets, I feel like they're pretty insulated from a lot of these big trends. Second of all, in the age of AI, we believe that your AI is only going to be as powerful as the data that it's trained on. And if you look at what's happening today, all the big players, OpenAI, etc., there's a data race, right? If you look at all the publicly available data, that has been mined. And I think this next, wave will be around obtaining proprietary data sets. And what's super interesting about the areas that we invest in is that there's very little public data on them anyway. So I'll give you an example. Women's health, the data, the research, etc., that's out there is very little. And frankly, what does exist is very marred in bias. And so if you look at a company, like, for example, we were very fortunate to have led the pre-seed of a company called MIDI, which is now one of the fastest growing women's health companies out there. It's like the virtual care clinic for women over 40. And they probably own the largest data set on women over 40. And so that data set only becomes more and more valuable in this age of AI. And given that, we were the early backers in some of these companies, I do think that I think we're very well positioned given what's happening in this AI boom that keeps us, frankly, insulated from this noise.
What's also really interesting too, in terms of the market that you're serving, is that like women over 40, right? Just overall, a very underserved market, even though they have incredible spending power, right? And I think a lot of kind of companies and startups, when you think about who they're appealing to in consumer, it's typically very younger, Gen Z, maybe millennial, who knows, Gen Alpha, kind of consumer. Whereas you're actually appealing to customers who, again, have disposable income and is incredibly underserved. And that's also super interesting and also very powerful.
Extremely. And I'm sure you know this. I think it's close to 80% of all household purchasing decisions are made by women.
Yeah.
Especially in this older generation that now have young kids. And 80% of the healthcare decisions. And so, it's a very powerful demographic. And look, it's not just women's health. If you look at things like the future of parenting, again, in the AI age, it's like we've backed companies that are focused on something called the family graph, right? How does a family today interact? Now, I'm a mom, I have 2 young kids. My pain points as a parent today are completely different to my parents' generation. And so who are the entrepreneurs that are building the tools, the technologies, the products that are going to help make my life easier? Now, that family graph, nobody's looking at. Like the big guys, the big AI companies are very focused on, individual agents, B2B SaaS like applications. Whereas whoever can own and control that family graph of how a family unit interacts, that's a very powerful data set to be able to tap. And again, it's like an area that we invest in. So it's not just women's health. It's a very exciting time, I think, to be investing in these historically overlooked, underserved markets.
Totally. So MIDI Health, I know that as you mentioned, they become a standout. And they're doing extremely well.
Yeah.
What did you see in that team early that maybe others didn't?
So something I think pretty unique to us as a fund is we already know what we're looking for. I haven't mentioned this yet, but we do invest very early. We like to be, the first institutional check into the company. Like we're real conviction investors. And what we do at Muse is for the sectors we invest in, we do these 3-month deep dives, like with our interns, and we are trying to identify white spaces before the market catches up. So to give you an example, the way MIDI happened, 5 years ago, we knew that menopause was a huge opportunity. And as a result, we talked to everybody in the space, all the players in the space. But we came to the conclusion that there was still a gaping hole for some kind of 360-degree virtual clinic that only catered to women over 40. We made that thesis internally, and then we went out to our network, and I'm very proud. I'm a Kaufman Fellow. And I went to my Kaufman network, and I said, listen, we're looking for a company like this. And thankfully, one of my classmates, who's a big health tech investor, is like, hey, I think this person's building exactly what you're mentioning.
Solving the problem that you wanted.
Yeah. And by the way, she's a serial entrepreneur, like they're a killer team. And I'm like, I need to meet them immediately. And that's how we found Joanna. And, when we met, I think what was super interesting is we already kind of knew the market so well that we were finishing each other's sentences, right? She didn't have to sit, which she had to do with a lot of other investors, and educate and explain how massive this opportunity was. We're like, no, we know. We have full conviction. Can we please write you a lead check, which we've never done before? Like, we had such conviction in like what they were building. And that's how the whole thing happened. And, MIDI's one example, but, it wasn't just menopause. A few years later, we came up with the thesis that, hormone testing was going to be really important. And, and again, went out to source these deals. We knew that, breast cancer detection and examination today was just terrible. Like what existed for mammograms was just terrible and could be resolved. And so we basically identify these trends, and then we go try and find entrepreneurs that are building.
So in terms of the investment style, if it's fair to say, it's a bit more top down in that you actually try to discover the trend, or you have an insight on the trend, and you kind of go and try to find the best company that you can find that's solving that exact problem that you're hoping to solve.
Yep, absolutely. And it's exciting because, we're doubling down on women's health. You feel like people now understand how huge this is, and, we're just getting started, but there's so much more opportunity, and we continue to do that process. It's like, okay, so what's next? And it's not just for women's health. Like I said, it's across the other sectors. But I think women's
Totally. So, in all the other sectors that you invest in, including obviously women's health, do you ever get surprised? Meaning, since you're investing kind of like top down and you have this insight, and then you find the best company that's actually solving this problem, and maybe you don't need to be educated about it because you've actually been doing a ton of research, market research already. Do you ever get surprised in terms of when you're talking to a company and say, oh my gosh, this is such an interesting way that you're solving this problem, or if it's a problem that didn't exist that is actually within my thesis?
I think, for example, longevity is a hot word right now, right? Like everyone's trying to invest in longevity, and you hear about all these companies that are being built. And, do I ever get surprised? What surprises me is kind of the lack of creativity and of innovation sometimes. I'm sorry. Like when you are so deep in a sector and you understand, and by the way, in something like women's health, it is a very, very complex industry to navigate, especially in the US, right? There's a lot of stakeholders, and
The healthcare system is, incredibly, incredibly hard to navigate,
incredibly, and even for us who've been investing in it over the last decade, we still learn. But what's fascinating to me is when you get entrepreneurs that are trying to build in these spaces, and they really do not understand like how complex the different stakeholders are, what it means to do a deal with a health system versus, an insurer versus, direct to consumer like healthcare companies. It's really hard. And I think what surprises me is there's a lot of entrepreneurs who still, don't really understand that. But then what is encouraging is sometimes you'll meet an entrepreneur who doesn't just know it, but they've kind of hacked it, and they've thought about, how they're going to, change their business model to address a problem. For these longevity companies today, I'm like, oh, you have function, you have superpower. Now, we're the thing that is going to come. And I'm like, yes, but America is not a cash pay America is not a cash pay country. It works on insurance. Like there's only so many people that can afford these, very expensive tests. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, exactly. Well, I guess how do you balance that, right? When you actually explore a new company and you say, okay, this is incredible technology, incredible innovation that you're building,
Mhm.
but in terms of how because it is this murky line in terms of does the consumer pay, does insurance pay? How do you kind of assess that? Because obviously, at the end of the day, it also needs to be a viable business for you to invest in.
But honestly, it's why there's like some companies that are out there today that like I'm still scratching my head as to how this scales, how this continues
Just
to.
because the consumer is paying for the whole thing, the whole bill, and the whole bill is incredibly expensive.
I mean, less expensive, I guess, than what it traditionally would be. I mean, I think, and in answer to your earlier question about, how do you avoid the hype, etc., we do believe in like fundamental business models, right? Business models that make money versus there's a lot of business models that are literally venture backed. And, sometimes that's worked. Like, okay, you just raise so much, you can't fail, but it's just kind of against our thesis. And a value that we're really proud of at Muse is like the democratization of care. There's a lot of companies out there that are obviously consumer technology companies that are concierge for those who can afford it, right? So aimed at the 1%. But we try and avoid those companies completely. We're trying to look for companies that, really understand the current healthcare system and how to work with it versus against it. That's where I think like true change and true scale can happen. But right now, there's a lot of noise about a totally different model, which we just frankly don't understand.
I know when we began this conversation, I was curious about celebrity partnerships and your approach for on the corporate side versus startup side. I know that your superpower is partnerships, if that's fair to say, just in general. When you look at a company and you find a company that you really like, what's your approach in terms of, okay, how can I be most helpful for this company? How also to navigate within partnerships? Because when I first think about partnerships, I'll be honest with you, I think about B2B companies and like, helping land, like, for example, a customer or, doing some type of partnership from that perspective. From the B2C route, how do you, because I know that you invest obviously in consumer technology, what's your approach to partnerships?
Well, it's really interesting. So I think at Muse, we've got a couple of unfair advantages. First of all, when we're due diligencing a company, one of the first things we do is go and speak to the potential like partners that they want to do a deal with. And we ask them if it's interesting to them. I mean, that is definitely something that's very unique to us, right? Because at the end of the day, if they're the kind of deals that are going to transform the company, we need to know how viable that is, even if it's a possibility. And so even in our due diligence.
Are you able to like give an example in terms of what that even looks like?
Okay, so for example, I'm close with the team at Disney. I will meet with like the innovation team, whatever, twice a year just to kind of see what they're working on. And, if we have a company that's trying to build, I already know like what they're prioritizing and what they're not. And so if an entrepreneur comes in and says, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, Z and, Disney, Mattel, et cetera on my list, I already know, like I know what they're
You have access that you can actually reach out to them and see if it's actually interesting.
And you're able to go back and give the entrepreneur like real feedback, like where it's, don't waste your time on this because it's not their priority. Like there's going to be other people that you can. So I think it's really unfair in terms of the due diligence process. And then like on the talent side, that comes from, truly understanding what matters to the talent, right? And I'll give you an example. We backed a company called Co-Fertility. They're really innovating in egg freezing and donation. And we ended up helping them create a partnership. And she came on board as an investor with Maria Sharapova. And the authentic part of this was she loved the company so much because for her as a professional athlete, she would say, why is it that at the peak of my career, it's also the peak of my childbearing years? Why do I have to choose? Like athletes, female athletes should be able to have technologies like this that exist where they can freeze their eggs and not have to worry about these two things. That's a very authentic, aligned just value with the company.
Yeah.
And so she, once they met, it was like, of course, like this is perfect. And she didn't just invest, she also, helped front a whole campaign because she truly believed in the mission. And they're honestly the exact kinds of partnerships that we will work on. We won't work on anything else.
This episode is brought to you by Glimpse. Glimpse is an AI-powered end-to-end deductions management service that's focused on recovering revenue from KeHE, UNFI, Amazon, and Target for consumer brands. They centralize deductions with backups, they fully handle disputing on your behalf, the brand's behalf, and streamline the accounting process. For more information, check out tryglimpse.com and let them know that Mike sent you.
Thank you for that example. I'm also glad that's a great example, and I completely agree with it. Also, I'm glad that you brought up Maria Sharapova because I'm just a big tennis fan. But this is also a great transition as well to Muse Sport. too, and the sports side of Muse. How did Muse Sport come as an extension? Is it an investment vehicle? Is it an advisory firm? What was kind of, how did that spur that? Because it seems quite different from Muse
Yep.
Capital from the initial origins.
So the origin of Muse Sport actually comes very much from my partner Assia's background. So I'm sure you can tell I'm a huge fan of my business partner. She's brilliant. She's visionary. She sees things like 10 years ahead of everybody else. And actually, of all the incredible things she's done in her career, um, one was being on the board of directors of one of the biggest sports teams in the world. It's a team called Juventus,
Yep.
which is,
I'm a big soccer fan, so that's just, I mean, that is unbelievable.
we call it football in Europe, but yeah.
Football, yes,
exactly.
football.
And
Yeah. Go for it.
she was the first female and the youngest in the board's 120-year history. And so, she's always had this deep connection to sport. And of the many things that she did while at Juventus, one of the things she was most proud of was setting up the women's team, right? So the women's Juventus team, or getting that through. And so just sport has kind of been in our DNA at Muse. And I will never forget 10 years ago, Assia telling me, Rachel, women's sport is going to be huge in the US in the next 10 years. And I was like, okay. And while she was on the board of Juventus, obviously there was conflict. She couldn't do too much. But when she left, probably 3-4 years ago now, she would just see extraordinary deal flow. And because she had this real instinct and vision on what was going to happen with the space, she's like, Rachel, there's all these incredible deals I'm seeing. I feel like we're leaving opportunities on the table. And,
And in terms of deal flow, just because this is sports, not, venture, just want to understand, these are sports franchise deals, right? A franchise getting created or invested in sports franchises.
So there's like sports teams, sport team assets. And the way that we decided to do it, I said, well, listen, why don't we, actually a lot of our LPs are also strategic. I should probably mention this too. So a lot of them are owners of sports teams. And so for them, listening to Assia on the fact that women's sport was going to be huge was very interesting. And, they're very familiar with the asset. And so we said, you know what, for opportunities that we really think are, the next big thing, let's just pull together a separate SPV, tell our investors about it, and take an allocation, very kind of hands off, not too much, just, here's an opportunity, here's an allocation. Do you want to do it? And so an example of that was the Washington Spirit. So Assia saw it very early, and I'm not sure how much you know about NWSL, but it's kind of exploding today. And again, hats off to Assia. And then we've seen some other really fascinating kind of opportunities, since then, just handpicked here and there. And so we decided to set up an advisory group. And what the advisory group does is, send these deals to our network. Sometimes we set up SPVs, for allocations in some of these opportunities. And so it's just taking advantage again of kind of the Muse magic and the Muse network. And, LPs love it because it's getting this proprietary deal flow that they wouldn't see elsewhere.
That's incredible. That's so interesting. And yeah, I mean, you all definitely saw it early when it comes to women's sports. That's for sure.
Well, I should probably mention the other one, which is SailGP. I'm not sure how much you know about this deal, but
Tell me a bit more about Sail. Yeah, would love to learn more.
So again, came across our desk. Assia says to me, Rachel, I think there's something here, and digs, and we end up investing in the USA team. Now, the history of SailGP, so it's actually founded by Larry Ellison. Larry Ellison is an avid sailing fan, did not like the America's Cup, and so ended up deciding to fund and create his own rival league called SailGP. And the whole point of it was the America's Cup was very much for the billionaire circuit, so he wanted to create something that was more aspirational, and ended up creating his own league. It is the Formula One circuit, so it's for Assia. Basically, she turned around, she said, I think this is the next Formula One. I was like, wow, okay. And the really fascinating thing that we loved about this opportunity was it's one of the only professional sports where men and women can compete on the same team.
Wow.
So very aligned with the Muse kind of DNA. And after doing the US deal, Assia became very close with the league, and we ended up getting the opportunity to potentially buy the majority stake in the Italian team. And I mean, you can imagine the conversations 2 years ago. She's come back and I'm like, what do you mean? And through just an incredible set of circumstances, it's actually how we met now our third partner, who's an incredible woman called Elizabeth Gill, who was actually at the Rain Group for 10 years. So the biggest TMT bank that has essentially done every major sports team acquisition you could imagine. And she met us, agreed with Assia that she thought this was a huge opportunity, and the two of them ran the deal. And as of about 2 months ago now, we are the majority owners in SailGP Italia.
Wow. That's wild. How do you analyze maybe sports opportunities just overall? I mean, obviously you had SailGP, you had women's football that's really has taken off. Like, what's your thoughts about pickleball? What are your thoughts? Do you think that in tennis, I just have so many questions. Do you think that in tennis, for example, there will ever be a league that like how there was with live and golf? Do you think that there's something that will happen in tennis? Just kind of curious about how you think about like other opportunities when it comes to sports and kind of analyzing them.
So I think our whole view at Muse, there is definitely a moment right now, right, with women's sport and a lot of these emerging leagues, and it's certainly a hot topic. To your point about, avoiding, overhyped cycles, etc. We've actually thought about it very carefully, and the view at the fund is, listen, even though there's incredible opportunities, there's literally just a few that are really, really going to work.
Of course.
And so our view on being able to handpick the ones that we think like can really move the needle is the strategy that we have today versus, raising a dedicated fund that wants to invest, hundreds of millions just in women's sport, where you've got a gun to your head in terms of having to allocate, right, a certain amount of capital into a certain amount of opportunities within a certain time frame. We think a lot of people will probably lose a lot of money, unfortunately, but that there really are, just a few incredible opportunities. So by handpicking some of these, and again, Assia's the sports expert, as is Elizabeth, but I think at this point we kind of know what is worth pursuing and what is not. And I do think some of the things that you've mentioned are interesting, but
are interesting. Okay. Okay. Just wanted to get your kind of pulse of pickleball and some of the other and some of the other sports that are kind of rising. Cool. What are one or two books that have most influenced the way you see the world?
books.
Or have inspired you?
I'm trying to, well,
I usually ask if it's useful, what's one book that's inspired you personally and one book that's inspired you professionally? Might be a better way to look at it.
I think right now that professionally, listen, I think there's a lot that's happening with the administration around like the food industry today
Mm-hmm.
and kind of clean eating. And listen, we're based in LA. We're, at the forefront of this kind of movement. But I think, digging into kind of the American food system and kind of how it's been created is fascinating and, super controversial person. But it's called Good Energy. I just found it fascinating. I don't know if you know what that book is, but it's kind of all about the American healthcare system and how it's tied to food. And I don't know. It's just something that has been.
I haven't, but I've been kind of clearly not looking deep enough. I've been looking for a book or something that would help explain it. So I definitely want to check it out. Good energy. Okay.
Yeah.
I will certainly check it out. Cool.
It's very controversial, but absolutely worth
A read.
a read. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Awesome.
The personal side, I'd have to think. I have so many. I need
Sure.
to just think about.
Yeah, all good. My final question to you, if you had to distill Muse's mission into a single sentence that kids could understand, what would it be?
Investing in companies that should exist.
Love it. Love it. Rachel, thank you so much for your time. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me. I feel like we covered a lot.
And there you have it. It was awesome having Rachel on the show. I hope you all enjoyed learning more about her journey and Muse Capital. Glimpse, thanks so much for sponsoring this episode. Check out Glimpse if you're a brand looking for an end-to-end deductions management service that helps you recover revenue from KeyHe, UNFI, Amazon, and Target. Thanks for listening. Oh, and check out the newsletter, by the way. We work hard on that. theconsumervc.com for a roundup of all the latest news and updates that are happening in consumer each week. Thanks again for listening. Bye-bye.